Hello everyone and welcome to the Decking Awesome podcast. My name is Brian and I'm joined by the always awesome Kira and Owen.
Hello.
Hey.
Today we're going to talk about how we balance dice summoners, the different paths we followed to focus on the players, the balancing of the dice and cards, and sometimes just throwing the rules of balance out the window for fun. We have done a podcast previously on balancing board games, but that was more a general podcast on it. Definitely have listened to it if you get a chance. You can find all our podcasts online. Today we're going to focus specifically on dice summoners. I think dice summoners came out really well. The balance on it is great. There's no definitive path to victory. It's whatever strategy you choose and playing it well. So tell me, how did we balance it with keeping the variety and keeping it fun?
Well, the journey towards balancing a board game is always pretty difficult, but we tried to start off with the core concept of what did people enjoy when they're playing the game. And so that was trying to see when they played the game. One of the core concepts that they loved was picking up a whole bunch of dice, rolling them. There's also the concepts of like summoning cool creatures, like mythic creatures and things that they might are kind of familiar with. Lots of different kind of types of creatures out there and all sorts of different types of spells. Some people like to be a magician who, casts fireball, while some people want to have giant dinosaurs in their army. Everyone's different. And so also how that progresses from new players to advanced players as they learn more about the game.
Yes, so I think we picked out the really key parts that people enjoyed and combined them with the different stages of the game. So there is the start, middle and end of the game. And we kind of wanted to keep those three pieces intact and so that different things happen at the different stages. And we wanted to make sure that that progression, people could feel that they're actually doing more in the game as the game moves on and that there's something worthwhile happens in each of those stages. So while it's always hard to tell exactly when each of those stages starts and ends, it's important for players to feel like they are progressing. So you probably need to have quite clear sections in the game. And once you've figured out those sections, or at least a basic structure for those sections, it makes it easier to balance the game.
Yeah, because when you're playing the game, everyone kind of looks at the community cards in front of them and they might have this general idea as to what they want their final army to look like when they make their attack and as they progress through the game. So everyone has these grand designs of what they want, but some people also maybe want a smaller army and they'll probably get there quicker than everybody else. And other people want to get some people want to summon all the mythic creatures in the game. So it's all about trying to, yeah, some people do that, but it tends to make them lose because they spend so much dice on summoning mythic creatures.
All the effort going into trying to get the really big hitters out in the game.
Yeah, it's really fun though when you have them all in your army. But the opponent has their own scheme and their own plan, and so it's all about kind of building that army, building that game engine to try and capitalize on it and win at the end.
Yeah, and in each section, you kind of want to make sure that there's cards available to the players that they can use. Like as we said, pulling out all your mythic creatures as early as possible sounds like a great idea, but people who can kind of see the structure of it know that if you don't have enough dice for that, if you use all your dice straight away without building up a good dice base, you're just going to leave yourself without any actions to do and completely open to a player's attack. So because of that, we kind of realized that we need to make sure that when you're building up your army, you're balancing that you're building up dice or you're getting better hitters in the short term. So that's how we split up, I think, a lot of the pieces to create the balance. And then I guess the dice were key to keep in mind because while you get a lot of variance on the dice on what you roll, you actually should be able to do something with them at all times. So that's pretty key as well.
Yeah, because when you think of the dice in the game, you get the red and the blue dice. You see some people wanting to go for quantity, so they want to get loads of blue dice, and they have to kind of build an army related to that. New players don't really have to worry too much about this. The game is kind of structured so that if you just kind of pick whatever you want, you'll still get enough actions. You might be missing out on some points, but it should be pretty good. The only problem you can get into is, say you summon the Chimera kind of early game, you might not be able to attack with that Chimera because it requires 3 sulfur to do it. So those are kind of gotchas that new players would feel kind of annoyed because they summon this awesome creature and they can't even attack with it. But advanced players, and as they progress through the game, they'll realize that they can incorporate this creature in a different way than other cards, and so they start to see these small little differences in the cards and how they can affect the balance of your own army and what you're trying to go for. And so those, although the Chimera and the Baphomet, they're all end game big hitters, what you decide to do mid game or early game and the kind of composition of dice you pick, that really affects how well your army will function.
Okay, so where we're talking there about the early, mid, and late stage cards, this kind of thing led us to more of a balance of the game, so where you could balance it so that no one is running away with it too early. When you get to kind of mid game and people are settling into their plan, their routine, you can start to focus on what your plan is and, you know, building up a stronger army. And then you have the late game where you're sort of, you know, you're finishing it, you're ending it, you've got the big hitters out on the game. So talk to us about balancing like the early game cards.
Yeah, so those 3 stages are very, very kind of important to what we noticed that players were doing throughout the game. The early game, we noticed that people were trying to build up their army, trying to build up their choices that they can make. Some people just wanted to get as many dice as possible. That gives them more options for what to do later on. Some people wanted to make sure that the creatures and spells that they picked gave them an offensive advantage when it comes into the mid game. So all those kind of early game decisions, it's not just about picking a load of basic creatures that you're just going to eventually sacrifice. It's about what those creatures and choices give you depending on what the opponent does. And then when you look at individual cards, you can then kind of focus on their intention. So the kind of the biggest example, especially with early game, is the basic creatures and the spells. A lot of spells require 1 dice symbol. So things like the attack and defend set, and then all the basic creatures, they all give you 1 dice. And that kind of allows us to focus those 2 as one group and then compare them to each other. So like the spell cards don't give you dice. So we wanted to make them more powerful. So that if a player does pick them, they're not missing out. So one player picks a basic creature, one player picks a spell card. They might be losing out on a dice, but they'll have more options of doing aggressive things, or they might give themselves more defense so that they can kind of like skip a little bit of the mid game because they can defend against these massive attacks.
The other advantage of spell cards is what we found was in the early game, you might only have a limited amount of dice, and you can have a lot of dice left over if you're not planning carefully. And the idea is that spell cards were a way for us to fill that gap. So if you have an uneven number of dice in your early game, a lot of the stuff you need to do needs an even number of dice. Bringing spell cards in, when we originally decided to have them, was like for a use at the start of the game for a single dice. And maybe you've already used your creature attacks, or maybe you're building up your army and you're about to discard one of the basic creatures to summon an advanced creature. You want to be able to do something with the leftover dice you have that's still useful, especially for people who are really conservative. Some people will summon loads of creatures in the hope that they'll just have loads of dice, and by the statistical probability, they're going to get the dice that they need always. So they're going to get 10 dice when they know there's 5 symbols that they want, and they're just going to say that because they have 10 dice, it's likely that they're going to get them. Whereas some other people are really conservative with their dice. They're going to get enough that they can get the things they want. Maybe they're going to get like 5, but half of them are red. And then what you end up with is those conservative people can end up with 1 dice left over because they were looking for exactly the right amount. So I think that because we knew that in early game people were summoning basic creatures, we knew that we had that gap where you could end up with 1 lone dice, and that the idea was to bring spell cards into it so people who found themselves in that situation had something to do where it wasn't just carry over the dice.
So early on, you had the balance of spells that will do more damage, but you have the creatures that give you the extra dice, and that's the offset. So do you want to build up your army, get a lot of dice? Maybe you can't do a lot of damage up front, but now you have more dice, which gives you more options. Or do you want to be able to do a lot of damage up front? So that was a good early game way off of spells and creatures. So what about mid game then? When you start moving beyond your initial setup and deciding what you're going to do, where do you start going from there?
Yeah, mid-game is kind of where the game opens up, and a lot of the community cards become available to players and their different strategies that they want to pick. And one of the things we noticed that some people will tend to kind of, especially new players, they'll go for big hitters. So they'll go for like creatures that do like 4 damage with 1 dice, that kind of stuff. It doesn't create a super balanced army because you're expecting good rolls. And if those good rolls don't come, you can't do specific actions. So we find that there's a couple of different types of player styles. One of them just expects to get the best. And if they don't get that role, then their whole plan is shot. Whereas other players, more conservative, they want to get, no matter what I roll, I'll be able to do something with my dice, and I'll be able to do kind of more attacks. A couple of the mid-game cards that we kind of focus on were curses, those big, strong spell cards like combat sets, and then the advanced creatures.
Yeah, so I think the red dice come into play here a good bit. So in early game, you're probably not going to have that many red dice to deal with, but a red dice was almost an evolution to go along with the advanced point you're at in your army. So whether you pick some big hitter creatures, or maybe you just pick some advanced creatures that have red dice on them, you start to need those dice. So on none of the small lower level cards, or the cards that came out in the start of the game, need the triangle symbol that's only available on the red dice. So I think it becomes kind of key then to the later gameplay. If you've built up your army so that it needs red dice, you need to make sure you also get red dice, because you won't get enough wild cards on your blue dice to really fulfill all the things you need on those late game creatures. Summoning advanced creatures, auras, they're all much harder to get if you don't have those red dice. So you want to think about your long-term strategy. If you're going to just stay with low-level cards, and maybe you want to stay with blue dice because a lot of the spell cards only need blue dice, and that could be a strategy that you want to keep. And I guess that's, you want to focus on keeping just lots of low-level creatures. Whereas if you want to get those advanced skills, or you want to use a lot of the advanced creatures, you'll need the red dice to do that.
So that's actually a good point. When you throw in spells or when you throw in curses and auras into your mid game now, they're not cards that are inaccessible for people in the early game. So someone could sacrifice or could use all three of their dice to cast a curse on their opponent, but they've used all three of their dice. That's their entire turn gone. So now maybe they're leaving themselves very exposed. So the opponent goes, all right, well, you've done a bit of damage to me at the start of my turn, but you haven't defended yourself at all. So now I'm going to punish you for it. So, while the mid-game strategy options are there for your early game, it might not be a great idea to do them early game. So that's a progression in the game that you see. Using 3 of 4 dice is very detrimental, but using 3 of 8 dice, not so much. So as you go on in the game, you get more creatures, you get more dice. Now all of a sudden, casting curses, learning auras, maybe it's a better strategy for you. And then I suppose when you move into the likes of the mythic creatures, the endgame creatures, now you're going to start using a lot of them. So where do the mythic creatures come into endgame?
Yeah, mythic creatures, they are what all players kind of notice straight from the go. They look at the powerful creatures coming out in the middle and they think to themselves, I want that creature. Or they might build their whole kind of army around that. If it's a big hitter who does like Baphomet, who does like 7 damage, they want to kind of create a good army composition where they can use the 2 red dice that Baphomet gives to kind of integrate into the rest of their army in case they don't get what they want. But because mythic creatures are such powerful creatures, we noticed when we were balancing the game that they were too strong. And once they were onto the field, the player was almost guaranteed to win against someone who didn't have a mythic creature, even if they were trying to learn one themselves. So we put in this kind of ritual aspect, which meant that the person had to use 5 sulfur, which we found was a very kind of balancing number, which gives the opponent the chance to notice that the opponent is now summoning a mythic creature, and then they can deal with that fact. Because usually in dice summoners, it's almost instant. You get an advanced creature, you get a curse, the opponent casts a spell. It's all very instant and reactive. You're going to have to guesswork on what the person's doing. But with a mythic creature, you know that they're summoning a mythic creature next round. And it's up to you to use that to your advantage. Know that they're about to kind of use up a whole bunch of their powerful dice on that. And it's your time to take the advantage. So some people will summon a mythic creature themselves in that time. Other people will take the advantage and attack if the person's not defending. So yeah, I think that's really powerful.
And I think the end game isn't all about the mythic creatures, though. I guess mythic creatures are just probably the only creatures that are really going to make a substantial difference in endgame. A lot of the endgame is about using what you've built to defeat your opponent. So it's that sort of jumping to claim victory and finish the game. Yeah, we're careful about how long we wanted it to feel. I guess there was a lot more to that. But the key was that while mythic creatures don't necessarily have to come out in the endgame, or they can help or hinder, the endgame was all about making sure that the game came to a conclusion, that it tied up, and that the cards that were available to players at that time were towards that goal. So if it was very close up to that point, bringing out a mythic creature can push you just that little bit over the line so that you defeat your enemy.
Yeah, I'd also consider auras to be endgame cards as well, which kind of really help the player determine. Auras are a little bit different because they don't require as many dice as mythic creatures, but if you see them and you kind of know the game a little bit, you can create your army composition based around the auras, hoping that you'll get them in the late game. Although that could, open you up to weaknesses. If you're kind of focusing on one specific thing, your opponent can see that and then could take advantage of it. This is one of the things we've noticed during the balancing steps, is that even if you know all of the ways the dice summoner is balanced, the more and more you play, the more experience you get, you can then still not fully utilize that to your advantage. So a good example is someone who starts off and they're just summoning basic creatures and advanced creatures, just so that they can build up this kind of army more and more and more. An opponent can see what the player is doing and can take that time to maybe learn a spell early game and then do some quick damage to the person's HP because there's no defense. Because it doesn't cost that much dice. You can take off almost half the person's defense before they've built their engine. And so if you're paying attention to what your opponent is doing and your own plan, and you kind of modify it based on it, you can see that these early game, mid game, and end game can kind of change rapidly, and you can change your plan and build. And instead of having to build your full army with auras and mythic creatures, if you can potentially win without doing any of that, and you can take the kind of advantage and win right in the mid game, you should definitely take it.
Yeah, that's a good point. So no matter what strategy you're taking, you're giving yourself an option for victory, as long as you're keeping an eye on your opponent to make sure that you can nip their plan in the bud as well. While if you see them clearly building up towards these mythic creatures that are doing big damage, maybe an aura with all of your advanced creatures is going to do just as much harm as their big guy when they finally get him out on the board.
Yeah. Because you can see if your player is just going for one specific type of thing, whether it's healing or defending or attacking, if they don't have a nice balanced composition, then they're requiring like good rolls to be able to stop you from doing your plan. So you can kind of take advantage of it. And, it's all about that looking. It's not just two-player solitaire. This is very much a kind of interactive, what stage of the game, because different players might be in different stages. One person might be in late game trying to get that mythic creature, trying to get that aura, while another player is just getting more and more advanced creatures with blue dice. And it's just saying, I don't need to go there.
Yeah.
I can stick in this stage.
I can do medium damage. I have enough spells to use up my dice. I can fight my battle from here.
Yeah.
I know when you're balancing a game, I know you can balance a game to within an inch of its life where it stops being fun. You can have it so that every strategy works and every strategy has a good chance of winning, but it's boring because you've over balanced it. So what kind of issues or what kind of difficulties do you face when you're trying to balance enjoyment and a balanced game?
Yeah, this is one of the things we noticed with the mythic creatures especially, which was that people really enjoyed summoning mythic creatures and they felt they were really powerful and they were really like the crux of their army. But when we're doing playtesting, we noticed these are highly imbalanced. These were very easy to get onto the board, and I think it was only like 2 or 3 sulfur at the start. I can't remember.
I think it was 3, yeah. And even that, it so seems high, but it wasn't that hard.
Yeah, because not only are the creatures really strong and powerful, high defense, high attack, but they also give the best dice. And so we added in that ritual thing. Our original decision, what we were thinking of doing, was just reducing the strength of the creatures, whether that means reducing the strength of the dice or the attack or the defense. Doing any of those kind of ruins the fun.
Yeah, well, people enjoy having the big hitters. People want the real damage doers on the board.
Yeah.
And having a little bit of a challenge. Like, they're not easy to get out on the board, and you kind of feel good about bringing them out. Yeah.
So when we added that ritual, first of all, it was tricky because it's a special rule, kind of, and people found it a little bit tricky. Once they understood it, they actually got more enjoyment out of that kind of challenge of actually getting it out onto the field. I survived. Baphomet's out there. You're only on 6 health. The other guy's on 20, but I still got him out. Stick up a defense and then just attack.
Another thing that we hemmed and hawed over was the rolling the dice. So I guess everyone enjoys rolling dice. It's a lot of fun.
Love rolling dice.
And we are definitely totally on board with that. Like, Roll for the Galaxy, one of the most enjoyable games. You can potentially roll a ton of dice. Yeah. And I guess when we brought that in, we allowed players to build up massive armies and roll tons and tons of dice. And the problem was that started to, first of all, it would cost a lot to have 50 dice in the game, and it would be way too expensive for us to produce. But also, it doesn't really make for a balanced game if one person can just go miles outside of what we were aiming for. It could make the game last a really long time. So what we did there was we started to put kind of a limit on how many creatures you could have. So as creatures give you dice, that means that there's a limit on how many dice you can have at any time. So that also helped with us pushing people into the end game, because there's a certain point where either the army you've built works or doesn't work. You've either built it well, so it works with the dice you've got, or you built it terribly and you need to be defeated. So what we did was limiting those amount of creatures, restricted the size of the army. It meant that we now had a hard limit on how many dice somebody needed to use in the game. So we knew exactly how many dice we needed to put in the box. But that was a bit where we kind of had to force a limit on something so that it could balance the game and the game didn't go crazy. So even though we all enjoyed the rolling the dice, we did have to rein it back so that it made sense.
Yeah, because people really do like rolling those dice. Totally agree. Putting that limit in also kind of gave different strategic elements to the game that we hadn't kind of really noticed before. It's kind of annoying if you have 6 basic creatures out and you roll 2 more mercury that you can't get another basic creature. But I think that's also like a good show of like what else, you're going to roll more mercury in your game. You need to figure something to do with this instead of just, if you don't have anywhere for these dice to go, then you're just going to have wasted dice. And so it's very much up to the players to kind of strategically come up with ways of using them in an effective way to win. So putting those hard limits on the cards kind of makes like the objective of the game more clear, and it kind of focuses players. So it's pretty good.
Yeah, it's a good way of the game. The game is quite balanced in that you get to a point where you've done as much as you can with this strategy. So you start summoning all basic creatures to get as many dice as you can out. And yes, great, early game, that works very well. You're rolling 6 dice while your opponent might be rolling 4. And you're at a great advantage then, numerically anyway. But as the game goes on, now you have to start replacing your creatures. So you go, okay, well, I've built my army. What do I do now? So the game encourages you to evolve your strategy, to change it, to diversify. So if you focus on just one element of the game, if you go, I'm just going to go all out attack, you're not going to win. If you go all out defense, you're not going to win. All out healing, you're not going to win. It forces you to kind of diversify between a good mix of healing, stealing, attacking, defending. If you can't put up a couple of different strategies, you're not going to get very far in the game. So if you go all out attack, your opponent's just going to go, okay, I defend against half of that and I attack you back, but you have no defense. So it'll ultimately be your downfall. Same with that person who just puts up a giant wall of defense and does no attacking. All the while they're doing that, the other person's just building and building and building their army. So by the time they come to face that wall of defense in earnest, they can now do 30 damage. They wipe out your wall, they take off 10 health. You put all the effort into putting the wall back up and the wall gets knocked down again.
Yeah. It's definitely a tricky one because, I think we found a great balance of the amount of maximum dice that a player can have and have fun rolling before they realize that, it's not just too boring. Because if you keep summoning mythic creatures and you keep adding in more and more advanced creatures, at some point you're just going to be holding like a much too big a pile of dice. Whereas, if you kind of cap it at a certain point, you're kind of leaving the players wanting more. They're just in there for rolling dice. Because people really do love just picking up a handful of dice and rolling them.
You never see as much joy in someone's face when they're playing the game as when they pick up like 12 or 13 of the dice and just drop them all at once.
One of the other issues that we found out was everyone kind of has their own strategy. When they see dice summoners the first time, they kind of gravitate to certain styles. But we wanted to kind of focus on interaction and kind of aggression and then competing for the win. So originally when we balanced the game, we had like the same amount of attacking creatures as defending creatures. We had lots of healing and stuff. And we didn't really have the concept of deck sets at that point. And we found that the games can kind of drag on a little bit if one person is perfectly defending and one person is perfectly attacking. But we found that we can kind of limit that and kind of change it by deciding what kind of cards are in the community, what kind of cards are available to people. And then if they want to defend, they just know that it's not going to be their whole thing. They won't be able to get just a full wall of creatures and spells. They can put up a significant defense, but they're going to have to think about alternative options as well. Like what kind of aggressive things can they do? What kind of heavy hitters they can put in.
So you have a good balance of the types of cards that are available to you. Does this then mean, you can make other changes, you can go down different routes? What kind of options does that give you?
So I guess we're able to figure out what sort of cards played well together. In the game, if you look in the rulebook, we have different deck sets that are available. And what we did was, when we found the balance of what worked well together, we were able to put together cards that play against that. So if you want to play kind of an attack game, we knew which cards drove that attack. But we were also happy that if you pick any 4 cards in the game across any of the advanced creatures, that they will work together. Some of them won't be, if you really want an attack game, obviously you don't bring in a load of angels, because that's just going to cause you to not have any cards you want to draw. But we did know that if you did mix a lot of angels with a lot of dinosaurs, they still balance. It just brings forward a different type of game. So having the balance across all the different sections and knowing where the basic cards fit, where the advanced cards fit, and where the mythic cards fit, you know how you can combine those things. So it made the gameplay pretty smooth, and we were happy that no matter what people decide on for, if they want to make up their own deck sets, that they work pretty well.
I like the idea that someone's listening to this who hasn't played Dice Summoners and is now just imagining a dinosaur riding a T-Rex into battle. That's exactly how the game works.
Yeah. Pretty much. Yeah, lots of different styles of cards. I think some people gravitate towards the angels, some people gravitate towards like zombies and stuff. We kind of have everything for everybody. Yeah, I'm really happy with the type of creatures that we came up with. Once you learn the balance of a game and you know the rules, so like even talking about the balance of the game, we knew the maths involved behind each advanced creature, each basic creature, and kind of the spells, and we knew how they would affect the main game, but they were still kind of loose. They had a kind of a vagueness to them, but at least we knew where the limits were, and so that allows us to create new cards that were kind of unknown beforehand. So one of them is kind of like the werewolf, who is kind of a very cool card who can attack in 2 different abilities. So he has no defense. And that's kind of a very interesting way of going, they can get defense from some other card. So we don't actually need to create defense here. And it allows us to kind of come up with these cool new ideas. The
sacrifice set was one of those cool new ideas that we brought in. We don't have it in the basic set because it's kind of an extra set of rules you have to know. But we could, because we had an idea of how much a basic creature was worth, I guess, in the overall balance of the game, having a spell that you could sacrifice a basic creature to get an attack or a defense, we were able to figure out what that cost would be. So bringing in new skills and stuff, once we had some sort of base that we could match it to, meant that we didn't bring in a skill that totally broke the rules of the game or imbalanced the game. Bringing it in kind of, once we followed the structure that we had in place and all the different steps we wanted, we were able to bring in a spell set that had a really unique feature and really unique elements to it without breaking the whole game.
Yeah, that's very cool. And like when we're playing this as well and playtesting it, those deck sets you were mentioning, some of them came up kind of naturally as well. So we found that we have the balanced deck set. It's pretty much a starter one. It's also one that we play all the time just because it's very kind of straightforward. It doesn't have all the complex abilities, but it gives a good gameplay time. But as we're playing the deck sets, we realize that the combinations of the cards can lead to longer games where most of the game is done in end game. And then you have the attack set where, if you have a very good mid game and you've got some good dice rolls, you can win mid game before any of the mythic creatures are summoned. So all these kind of things, they really help make you understand, get more knowledge of the game. Like curses are a great example of a good card that we learned from balancing the game, because they're tough to figure out. Like if you look at the Achilles Mist, it does like 9 damage over 3 rounds for 2 salt, which is way too powerful. Usually that would be like 6 damage, but this does 9 damage. And I think through playtesting and through understanding the balance of the game, if people expect 3 damage each round, they can defend against it, and it kind of works its way out. So you can kind of see into making things more powerful. But if you understand the rules of the game, you can see that they're not going to be that powerful, because, in 3 rounds time, both people's armies are going to be stronger anyway. So that 9 damage is kind of reduced.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So what about the dice? We have blue dice and we have red dice, different faces on both. How do you balance those?
Yeah, well, when you have balance of the whole game and all the different cards, you begin to see that if you have a lot of blue dice or if you have a lot of red dice that are coming in from different cards, you can see how balanced those dice are in comparison to each other. So if one person chooses a style where they only pick blue dice and they only pick blue creatures, and then another person picks like some red creatures, you can see that the person with the red dice beforehand, we had it so that the red dice had 3 wild cards. That person gave them more options, and that dice became too powerful. It wasn't as balanced between the players' strategies.
And on the opposite side of that, we had no wild cards on the blue dice for a while because we knew what sort of structure they needed to be, and we were kind of thrown back and forth as to what the 6 symbols should be on the blue dice. We knew we didn't want any of the sulfur symbols because that gave too much of an element of you could do anything with the blue dice. And the whole point of the red dice was that it was an evolution of the blue dice. So we played around with it and we tried it out with having no wild cards. And having no wild cards meant that there was no like drive to aim for a card. So the players' like enjoyment of getting a wild card when they roll the blue dice was lost. So we really had to balance that carefully. Like, you wanted people to go, oh yes, I got something I can do anything with. Even though at the start of the game, all you can do with a wild card is either use the salt or the mercury symbol. There wasn't anything very fancy you could do with it. But having it on that gave people a little more enjoyment and a little more feel like they rolled a really good roll. So we kind of had to balance the fact that according to the maths we had applied, a wild card didn't really fit on it. But on the red dice then, having too many wild cards, even though mathematically you want the red dice to be amazing, you have to balance out the fact that that's maybe too much. You want people to have wild cards in the game, but not to just get them all the time so that they kind of phase out of it and the people with the red dice are just going to win.
Yeah. It's the same with with this kind of balancing and looking at the different dice as well. It helps us really consolidate on what those faces should be. I think I'm really happy with how the dice showed up. And then when you have a red dice and a blue dice, depending on what your army is and the army you're trying to go for, they can both be as valuable as each other, depending on what you're trying to go for. You got a lot of spells, you got a lot of creatures that require a lot of mercury. You're well worth just getting more blue dice than only a couple of red dice. It also leads us to doing interesting things like the Chimera card. So the Chimera creature, that one gives you 2 blue dice and a red dice, which is different than any other creature. And that's because we wanted the creature to be a little bit weaker, to not give it as many dice, because it does a big 10 attack. And we found that having 2 blue dice and a red dice, although that's more dice, it's not as effective at the end game. People want those red dice if you get a mythic creature. But you can use it to your advantage as well. If you're not even going to use the Chimera's attack, you're only going to use those blue dice. You can use that kind of disadvantage to your advantage.
So you're summoning the biggest hitter in the game, the guy who does the most damage, and you're literally just using him for the dice he gives you.
Yep.
Being happy with the balance of the game on the whole really brought in a lot of new game options. So one of the things that we figured it was possible was simultaneous gameplay. So I think, Owen, you had been looking for this in the game for a while. You had been trying to figure out some way to just make the game progress faster in some instances. And because we knew the core mechanics were stable, I think that really brought a lot to that, to us allowing us to make a simultaneous game mode.
Yeah, and because we knew it was balanced, we pretty much just chopped off the end game and we made it so that the limits are now 4, which meant that we still had enough, depending on the deck sets you pick and stuff, you could still limit the amount of dice that the person has so that it makes sense and they can't go overboard. So that was really interesting, because it's only because we understood the game and we had the balance of the game down that you can do those kind of changes and you don't have to worry too much about it, because a couple of play tests, get it into people's hands, see if they enjoy it, and you don't have to worry about like, oh, what would the sacrifice set do in that kind of situation, or there's like a small sub rule here. If all the balance is done already and the specific use case scenarios balance themselves out, then everything's going to work. So those curses, they still work in a very small amount of dice in that simultaneous gameplay. A simultaneous play is the quick play variant rules that we have on our website, and you can definitely check them out. If you haven't heard of them and you have dice summoners, definitely check them out.
Yeah, you can download a PDF with the rule set on them. And we found that like we did get a lot of kids under 14 playing the game, and sometimes they can get a little frustrated because it takes so long. And quick play definitely, it doesn't have the strategic value of the long version, but it keeps them active and interactive. So if you're playing with a kid, or I think that's where our core market for that shorter game is. And I know we now send out the rules with any purchases recently, but we didn't actually have those rules when we started out because we didn't see the market for it, and we didn't really understand the full balance of the game until we got really comfortable with watching other people playing. And now pretty happy that provides an alternative if you want something a little more fast paced without the longer end game and the longer strategic value.
Yeah, which brings up a good point of multiplayer in Dice Summoners as well. So like, a lot of people have asked for like 3-player or 4-player Dice Summoners. And although the balancing of 1v1 allows us to know what the kind of rules is in specific kind of scenarios, having multiple players fight in a competitive game adds a whole different set of challenges to the balance and the rules. We have some pretty cool ideas. It's usually going to be like 2v2 or 2v1 instead of free-for-all. We've thought about the free-for-all rules and stuff, and we can never figure it out other than fighting someone to your left.
Yeah, the problem is king making. Without forcing people not to choose who to attack, it just seems a little bit like bullying happens. And maybe that's just because we don't play that many competitive games ourselves. So we would play a lot of 2-player competitive games. But when you get up to 3 or 4-player, you want to just be careful about like king making and everyone bullying somebody.
It's tricky because not just bullying, but if you're playing in a free-for-all game with 3 players, who do you attack?
Yeah.
Because if it's your first go and you've just summoned like this kind of werewolf who can only attack, you have to pick someone, and you're just gonna annoy them.
And that's where king making becomes a hindrance. For those of you who don't know, king making is basically where you're not going to win, but you decide who does win. So say the 3 of us are playing and I've been knocked down. I've only got 2 health. I know I'm not going to survive past this round, no matter how much defense I put up. I can just dedicate all of the dice I've rolled to attacking one of the other players. So I basically choose who's going to win the game, which isn't always as fun. You can play a very good game, and then if both players turn on you, all of a sudden, it doesn't matter how good a game you've played, you're 2 against 1 and you're not going to win. So balancing a game like that becomes quite tricky and quite difficult and hard to do in a fair way.
Yeah. So that's why games like 2v1 or 2v2, they can make sense. They can be kind of with the simultaneous rules. We're still kind of working at doing still a lot of playtesting on Dice Summoners on that kind of area. But yeah, we have a quick play variant, which is very fun. And so if you do have 3 players, just play 3 games of quick play variant. Or you can make up your own rules as well. The game's balanced enough anyway.
If you make up your own rules and they work really well, send us an email. So is there anything else you'd talk about with regards balancing Dice Summoners?
On our journey through like balancing Dice Summoners, we do find that getting the knowledge of the cards, individual cards, and then the overall scope of the game, it kind of always leads to like new ideas and new choices, and then kind of a laser focus as to what the problems are. And you might have a game where you're not really sure what the balance is and you're kind of working on cool new cards, and you might have to come up with like new ideas. If you know the balance of a game and you can see the gaps in your game, like new cards and new abilities and new mechanics and stuff that just fit in, because you're like, okay, well, I've got this healer and this defender. Well, what if I had a guy who, stole health? Or what if I had a guy who just did attacks and like 2 different attacks? Like new mechanics and new solutions, they just kind of fit into place when you make this kind of graph of your whole game. It's always going to be worth it, balancing a game.
Okay, I suppose for anyone listening who hasn't managed to get themselves a copy of Dice Summoners yet, it is available on our website at www.dag.irish. If you want to give it a try before you purchase it, we have the game up on Board Game Arena at the moment. Thanks to Owen and Kira, who've put in stellar work over the last couple of months getting the game up and running.
So Board Game Arena is a platform where you can play board games for free. There's a premium tier, but you should be able to play Dice Summoners without the premium tier. Obviously, it's a really good platform. We really enjoy playing, especially through COVID. It has been a real lifesaver on getting to still play board games with our friends. The advantage of the platform is things like the rules that we have, they're all inbuilt into the program. So you don't have to remember that. You get an opportunity to use defense against a curse. The game will put in all those rules automatically. So it's actually quite an easy way to play a game. And it can be a little bit easier than on Tabletopia and stuff where you have to remember the rules, though they are really good platforms as well. So I think Owen has put in a particularly large effort on this. He got it up online for alpha and beta testing. So we're really, really pleased with how it came out. And it's definitely true to the game. So try it out on there. I think it's boardgamearena.com.
Yeah, just Google Board Game Arena and then search for Dice Summoners and you should find it. There's a whole bunch of free games to play on Board Game Arena that you can definitely check out. We got loads. You probably will find us on there as well if you want to have a game. But yeah, it's really fun.
All right, guys, I think that pretty much wraps it up on how we balance Dice Summoners. If you've enjoyed this, please share it, tell your friends, find us on social media. We should be across all the platforms and give us a follow. We've been decking awesome games and thank you for listening. See you later.
Cheers.
Bye.